I think that's gone live. Insertion. Not. Ah, there it is. Testing, testing. Speaking at a normal volume. Okay. That. That. I think I'm live. I think maybe be a better set than last time. We shall see. Hey. Hey, folks. Good evening to you too. Hello. Welcome, welcome. Still getting all my bits and pieces where they need to go, so bear with me, but thanks for showing up. And if you care to, let me know where you're tuning in from, where in the world you happen to be, and your age if you want to as well, so I get a sense of who's here, what's going on, where we're all at in different demographic groups. Got a slightly different setup than I tried last night. I'm hoping it works a bit better. I've got the Instagram here now. I've got the Twitch right here. So I think I should be able to keep track of everybody a little bit more efficiently this time. That's the theory. We'll see how it goes, though. I did a lot of stuff incorrectly these past several times that I've done this. I had the entire 60, 70 minutes or so completely muted on Twitch. It was going fine on Instagram, but on Twitch, apparently, after about the 11-minute mark, I switched over my screens using this software that I use to live stream on there, OBS, and it didn't have my microphone included. And so there were some incredibly patient people sitting in the room watching for the entire 70-minute live stream, and they couldn't hear a thing. They were just watching me make faces at them, basically. It was very kind of them to let me know afterwards that they initially thought it was their technical difficulties, but it was definitely mine. So apologies for anything like that that happens this time. Please do let me know. It's probably not your technical glitch. If something seems to be going wrong, it's almost certainly mine. Let's see here. We got some folks from Rhode Island, 63 years young. Lovely. Missouri, 37. Dublin, 25. Those are some committed people, right? Yeah, that blew me away. I mean, it was very kind. I feel horrible about it because it was a stupid mistake, and it's something, as soon as they told me, I knew exactly what I'd done wrong. But yeah, unfortunately, because two different people let me know about this, and they both suspected it was their issue, not mine. And so they didn't let me know till afterward that it had happened. And I mean, I wish I could have corrected it midstream, but it's good to know about it now because this time, it seems at least, everything's going okay on Twitch. Folks on Twitch, you can let me know if something weird is happening. And if you can hear me, If you stop hearing me at some point, please let me know about that. Oh, I'm glad that you can hear me on Instagram as well. And sorry about the shaking. To get this position, so my setup, I've got my main monitor and my camera from my computer right in front of me, typically. And then my phone, last night when I did this, I basically had 3 very large board game boxes stacked up in front of me with a little tiny tripod with my camera put over to the side. And it wasn't great because I was having to switch my attention back and forth between the monitor and the phone constantly. So this time I've got this comically long like phone arm, and it's a bendable phone arm. And it's got to be 2.5, 3 feet long. It's stupidly long. And that's great because then I can have it attached to my desk and coming around to the monitor and getting right here in front of me so that it doesn't show up on the other camera. And I can have everybody right here in front of me. But because it's so long, it's kind of wobbly. And as a consequence, I think anytime I touch the phone, yeah, see, even a little bit, it's going to shake like there's an earthquake happening. So apologies in advance for that. Got Glasgow, Scotland, age 50. Jacksonville, Florida, 26. I like Jacksonville. Live and learn, exactly. That's what I'm trying to do here. Learning in public as much as anything else. All right, so I think I'll probably go ahead and get started here. The plan for tonight is the same as last night. This is a let's talk about the news conversation, and this is kind of a spin-off. It's connected to 2 of my other projects. One of them, most directly, I have a project called One Sentence News, where each and every weekday morning, U.S. Central Time morning, it could be evening depending on where you're at in the world, but every single weekday, I put out an email that contains 3 bits of news, and a little bit more than that too. There's a visual and a number and a link to something fun that I think you might enjoy, but the core of the email is 3 news stories, and I summarize those stories in 1 sentence apiece, and then give a sentence of context on top of that for each of these stories. And the idea is to hopefully allow people to have a better sense of what's happening in the world, but to do it in a way that's not overwhelming. And so to curate these articles to make sure that it's a decent representation. It's not going to be a perfect representation, obviously, of what's happening in the world. But here are some things that you might want to know about. It'll help you understand what's going on more broadly. And here's a fundamental understanding of those things in a way that my attempt, anyway, is not to dumb them down and not to make them so superficial that they're not useful. And over time, then, ideally, building up a bedrock, a foundation of understanding about these different things, so that then when you see something else in the news, you can immediately put it into that broader context that you're building out and say, oh, I get how that connects. I don't have to sit here and worry about this or feel threatened by something that doesn't make sense to me or feel stressed out by things that I'm not quite sure why I should care or I'm misunderstanding them. To provide a situational awareness about the news. That's the whole intention here. And so this conversation, which I'm doing every night this week to try it out, to see if a live stream of this kind makes sense, if it's useful for anybody. If it's useful for me, if it's valuable for you, to try it out, see if it makes sense, see what format for it makes sense, if some format does indeed make sense, and to essentially take questions. And take questions about the news items, to take questions about the news in general, to have conversations, to hear your feedback about these things, your opinions, what stands out about these different stories. Kind of like if we're sitting across the table having dinner and talking about the news, having that type of back and forth. So that's the intent of all this. And this is only the second time I've done it. Last night was a whole lot of fun. Other than my technical issues, I think things went all right. So that's the general schema here. Folks on Twitch see a little bit more because I'm able to display things on the screen as I'm streaming, I'm going to try tonight, because I can like flip to the back camera on my phone. I'm going to try to do that. I've positioned the phone so that you can see me now, and I believe, yeah, I think I can still flip it. So once I put that stuff up on the screen, I'm going to try to flip it so that you guys in Instagram land can also see at least some of what I'm putting up on the screen. That's the intention here. And to start out, I'm going to go through got the one sentence news that went out this morning. Today, what, January 8th? It's Tuesday, right? Yeah, Tuesday. And go through these stories, let you know what we're talking about. And then as I'm reading, if you want, go ahead and write down any comments, any feedback, any questions that you might have. And then once I'm done going through the quick summary and context for that story, I'll check and go through those and address those and add additional context if it makes sense to do so. That's the master plan. Let's see how it goes. So let me flip over browser view here. Let me see if I can do this. Aha! That's that. So that's kind of what I'm seeing. You guys still hear me okay there in Instagram land? This is my first time flipping things in this way. Okay. So the first story today, I moved my mouse to the correct place here. Thank you. Okay, good. So the first story today comes from the New York Times. China decides not to sell Olympics tickets to the Chinese public. The Winter Olympics, which are scheduled to take place in Beijing from February 4th through the 20th, will no longer allow ticketed Chinese citizens to attend. The Chinese government has already banned foreign visitors from attending the games, and now it would seem they're curating the audience so they have just the right number of just the right people, those who have been sufficiently screened and quarantined at these events. This newly announced ban of ticketed locals landed less than 2 days after Chinese health authorities reported their first Omicron COVID case in Beijing, which has led to a ban on travel into the city as part of their larger effort to maintain a zero-tolerance COVID infection policy, a policy that seems to be facing significant challenges due to Omicron's augmented transmissibility. So it's an interesting progression of this larger story, actually, because this is something that's been going on for over a year at this point, because we've known that Beijing was going to be putting on these Olympics for quite some time. Of course, they plan years in advance. But because of the controversies of what's related to what's been happening in parts of China with the, I mean, alleged, there's a lot of data backing this, but it's still technically alleged mistreatment of Muslim minority groups there, in particular the Uyghur Muslim minority groups living in parts of China who have been put into what the Chinese are calling re-education camps, basically, where they're learning different trades than they used before and learning about traditional Chinese tradition and learning Mandarin and doing a bunch of things, some of which you might look at and say, oh, okay, they're providing new skills and opportunities in education. Other aspects of these camps, though, look a whole lot like Soviet re-education camps, which were essentially gulags, labor camps, more or less. And so a lot of what's been happening around that already led to a great deal of controversy around these upcoming Winter Olympics that are set to happen in just a couple of weeks. But the pandemic, obviously, upped the ante on everything, made everything a bit more complex, and China has been doing a substantially different, or taking a substantially different approach to the pandemic compared to most other countries on the planet. They have aimed for what's been called a COVID zero approach. And the idea is that they test constantly. And they test people, and then they trace all of the people, somebody who's been shown to be infected, everybody that they've been in contact with over the period during which they might infect other people. They find them and they put them all into lockdown for a period long enough to make sure that they can't spread it to anybody else. And they're very assiduous about this. They're incredibly effective with it. And that is, I'll switch this back. And that is something that's worked very well, at least according to official numbers. It's anybody's guess as to whether those numbers are accurate. The estimate by some analysts is that global COVID numbers, in terms of both infections and deaths, are anywhere between like 1/2 and up to 1/5 of the actual numbers, just because we're not great at tracking them, and especially at the beginning we're not, but also in some cases the infections are not tabulated, and in some cases the deaths are attributed to other things because we weren't able to show that they were connected to COVID, or because of, it's just good for some governments to not seem to have very high numbers. So we don't know about the Chinese government in the same way that we don't know about everybody else's government. And as a consequence, we don't know exactly how well this worked, but because they've been so strict, anytime they find a cluster of what seem to be organically spreading COVID infections, they'll lock down the whole damn city. And what we've seen recently is when they found even just a couple of Omicron infections, they locked down entire portions, or in some cases entire cities, not just portions of cities, with millions of people in them, because they didn't want to run the risk that COVID would start spreading and then would end up in all corners of the country. And so that's a complexifying factor in all of this, that as they are hoping to put on these Olympics, which is an opportunity for any country to show the things that they're proud of about what they've accomplished, the things that they're doing in the world. In that moment, it's especially important to not have just a rampaging tide of new infections and hospitalizations and potentially deaths from a pandemic virus. But they're starting to see little infection spikes popping up all over the place. And at the moment, I think there's a little bit over 1,000. I want to say 1,200, but don't quote me on that. Officially acknowledged infections in China right now, which is dramatically lower than everywhere else, essentially, because of those lockdowns. But again, we don't know if that's the completely accurate number. And also, because they've done COVID zero, a lot of the population doesn't have any antibodies at all. There's just, people haven't been exposed to COVID, for better and for worse. Consequently, they're in a position where if they do start to see a spread, and especially with a variant like Omicron that seems to spread so much more effectively compared to other variants we've seen, if something like that really starts to spread, it could spread fast, and it could be absolutely devastating in the same way that it's been devastating elsewhere, in part because people are getting sick, and some small percentage of those people will get very sick and potentially die, but also because that would maybe shut down their economy and their institutions. If everybody's sick at once, even if it's just a bad flu, that's something that's potentially shutting down the entire economy. And especially when you're having people visiting, in this case, mostly athletes and some government, some diplomats and some honored guests from governments from overseas, you don't want them seeing your country shut down. You don't want them coming into town and everybody's sick and the hospitals are full and everything's being pushed to a level where it's just not sustaining anymore. That's embarrassing. And so we're at a moment where China has an opportunity to kind of show off a bit, and they're trying hard not to lose that opportunity, the way I think any government would. And yeah, so it's a difficult topic too, because it raises the possibility that some other governments might have done it wrong, in that a lot of us have not been as assiduous with locking down. And China can get away with that because they have a centralized, more authoritarian style government, and they can come in and say, well, you're not allowed to leave your house, and they will enforce that. No democracy allowed. But there's pros and cons, I think, to both models, and we're starting to see maybe some of the cons now, at least in speculation. Speculatively, we're seeing some of the cons. Because if this gets out of hand, and if they're not able to tamp things down, leading up to this great big event, that could be a very major problem for them, both in terms of having to handle the spread and in terms of losing that opportunity and perhaps showing a side of themselves that they don't want to show to the world. I think I saw a couple of comments come in here on Instagram. Please feel free to comment either in Twitch or Instagram if you have any thoughts about that. Any questions? It's completely illogical unless the entire world does it. Yeah, to a certain degree. My understanding is their plan and the plan of a couple of other nations too. Some other nations originally planned to do it this way, including, I believe, variations of that at least. New Zealand and Australia, and some other nations that are either island nations or they have borders that are not as permeable, so they're able to shut things down and to get away with it both economically and they can actually make that happen in terms of the amount of traffic coming through. And if you're in that type of situation, the way that China is as well, because they can shut things down if they want to, the idea is to lock everything down hardcore and then vaccinate everybody. And the idea is that then rather than people having to get sick to get those antibodies, you've just got everybody vaccinated. Well, the double whammy for them was that, one, they haven't managed to vaccinate everybody, and they definitely haven't gotten boosters to most people, which is what raises the antibody level and the level of immunity based on the best data available right now, at least. You have to have the booster to get to the point where we previously were with a 2-shot dose of vaccine. To get that same level of immunity, you have to have the 3 shots. And most people in China don't have that. And the vaccines that they locally developed, there's several of them, they do not work as well against Omicron. And a couple of them, I think, just barely work at all against Omicron because of the way that they operate. So it's a difficult situation. I can see the logic of it to a certain degree, but I also agree that it makes a whole lot more sense if everybody agrees to do the same thing. That is something that's a whole lot more maintainable, and it doesn't rely on perfect performance by everybody involved to get everybody the right shots, to get the right systems in place, to get all the right technologies and manufacturing. I mean, that is a very big ask, and it's something that sometimes a more top-down approach can achieve, but in this case they didn't manage to. Not in time, at least. Yeah, at this point, the aggressive contact tracing, it's going to be of limited value. I think South Africa might have tried that as well. Yeah, in New Zealand, they did do a pretty good job. They made a lot of people unhappy for a while. I remember a lot of the initial reports that people were peeved in the way people will get peeved when some of their options are taken away, even if it's potentially for a very good reason. But at some point, I believe, they weren't able to maintain that same level and they had to start vaccinating. I might be misremembering that, though. Please let me know if I'm missing a step in my memory there. It's been a long couple of years. But I do remember, I know that they've gotten a lot of accolades for the approach that they took in New Zealand, and I know it wasn't as borderline abusive as it has been at some times in China, where people are just locked down without any way of getting out, without any warning. It's authoritarian. It's the way that you operate, and again, there's pros and cons to that. Continue to ask questions or give feedback if you want. I'm going to go ahead and move on for the moment as you do that to the next story. Oh, this one's wild. This one has some really interesting context behind it, too. From the Associated Press, Sweden's spy agency probes drones over 3 nuclear plants. SAPO, the domestic security agency of Sweden, has taken over a preliminary investigation conducted by police into drones that have been seen lingering around and over the country's nuclear power plants. Sweden is far from the only country to be investigating these sorts of flyovers in the past several years, as drone technology, especially consumer-grade drone technology, has grown increasingly cheap, accessible, and capable. And while there's a good chance many of these sightings are evidence only of curious people wanting to see what these facilities look like from above, or folks who are just flying their drones nearby, There's also a chance such drones could someday be weaponized or used for reconnaissance purposes for other types of attacks, as has been the case in war zones and gangland conflicts around the world over the past handful of years. This is something I looked into quite a bit recently. How recently? I did a podcast episode on this. Maybe November. So, consumer grade drones have long been weaponized in Iraq and Afghanistan, in places where there's active combat, Syria. But more recently, we've seen them quite a bit in Mexico, in conflicts between cartels, and in some cases in conflicts between cartels and the police. And they are taking the same drones, the bigger ones typically, but these are drones that cost maybe $1,000, and they're taking them and attaching shotguns to them. They're taking them and attaching grenades to them. They're doing it dive bomber style, where they dive bomb a drone into somebody and kill them with an explosive. They're doing it in such a way where they have a remote trigger so that they can drop grenades from these drones over their enemies and doing like dive bombing runs. It's astonishing in a way that this hasn't happened sooner, because these drones have been around. And some of these events in Mexico in particular, at least the stories that I could find, there have been instances of police being threatened by drones, like showing up on their porch with a note and a grenade and basically saying, drop your investigation into this cartel. The implication being, we know where you live, we can get to you, we can blow you up anytime we want to. It's giving air superiority to groups that wouldn't necessarily otherwise have access to high technology or the ability to import them into wherever they happen to be. So it's astonishing that this didn't happen earlier, but it's also, to me, and this is maybe a cynical way of looking at things, but I'm shocked that we haven't seen a mass casualty event yet in citizen centers, as opposed to within war zones that utilize these types of weapons, because they are so relatively inexpensive compared to other types of weaponry that you might buy, and they're much easier to get. You can get them off the shelf. You can order them from Amazon or Alibaba. It's incredibly easy to get, and that leads me to believe maybe because they have to hack them together, they're just not as reliable as purpose-built weapons. But I suspect we'll see more of that sort of thing as they become more capable. Just what you buy and what you get in the box is sturdier, can go further, more maneuverable, more hackable, or as the hacks become open sourced, basically, where somebody figures out an easy way to turn these things into a bomb or a way to tote a shotgun and then puts it on the internet, and then everybody can do it with just parts off the shelf and cobble it together in half an hour. The more direct threat that's happening right now, though, in civilian centers, or within cities at least, is we're seeing a lot of flyovers, and this has happened in like off-limits areas throughout the United States over the past couple of years, including weapons research facilities, Area 51, places where they're testing jets and weaponry and doing scientific experiments, but also over nuclear plants, nuclear power plants and research plants. And only a couple of times has any of these drones done anything aggressive. In one case, I want to say Pennsylvania. Don't quote me on that, but there was a story about this in that episode I did a couple of months ago. I think it was Pennsylvania, where a power substation, which is like an electrical station that receives energy and then amplifies it and organizes it and sends it out to all the neighborhoods nearby, a drone came in with a metal cable dropping below it, and it lowered itself onto the substation, attempting to short it out and cause some kind of explosion or to knock out the power. And the theory here is that if you can take these drones, even with no weaponry, no explosives, no bullets, no guns, no anything that's conventionally a weapon, and you can hack together something like this, you could conceivably, in addition to going in and looking and finding the security movement of the people on the ground, finding access points, finding the places that you want to hit maybe for some kind of future attack, you can also potentially go in with one of these drones and just by like dropping it in or bumping it against something, do some damage. And that damage then could be combined with other such attacks or some other type of attack, non-drone related. And you could knock out the entire power grid for a decent chunk of a particular state or city, or conceivably, depending on the country. So it's interesting to think about in a really sad and scary way, because these are tools, like any tool, that the more useful they become for non-violent, non-militaristic, non-terroristic purposes, the more useful they also become for potentially dangerous purposes like these. And that's why stories like this end up in the Associated Press, because periodically, and I strongly suspect, just from knowing people in my life, including a couple of family members who are very into drones, most of these are probably just people getting a new drone and being really enthusiastic and saying, man, I wonder what that nuclear power plant looks like from above, and just not thinking that that could be seen as at all threatening or as some kind of security violation. I have to think that I would probably do the same accidentally with something nearby that looks interesting and I don't know what it is. And if I have a drone with a great camera on it, yeah, I mean, I'll probably fly it nearby. So a lot of these are probably that. But there's the potential that some adversary, be it another country, doing reconnaissance work or figuring out how quick a response is to a drone in these types of protected areas, so that if they ever came in with a weaponized drone, they would know how quickly, if at all, people actually respond to it on the ground. It could be prep, it could be mapping it out, it could be an actual attack. And so that's why spy agencies are getting involved, rather than just police, which would typically be the case, where they would try to find who it was and tell them, no, you're not allowed to do that. Maybe here's a fine. If you want to know anything more about that, though, do check out that episode. It is episode what? Episode 287 of Let's Know Things from November 23rd. It's a fun one. It's a fun one in that sort of grim way where you're trying to plot out, if I was a bad guy, how would I do this? Because that's kind of the stage we're at with a lot of the technologies we have, where they're fairly sophisticated and advanced and available. And that changes potentially the threat assessment map that we have with a lot of things. Let's see. If you have any questions or comments about that, please let me know. Drop them in Twitch or here on Instagram. I think I saw a few come in here on Instagram. Let's see. In fairness to China, though, they took care of their people during the complete lockdown. Seen accounts from people showing off their 3 free meals a day, plus all the necessities. Not everyone can pull that off. Yeah, I mean, I agree. My understanding is the most recent round, they were not as quick and complete with the support that they were giving people. But I believe earlier in the pandemic in particular, they were giving a masterclass on how to do lockdowns and take care of people. And I think several other countries have done the same. I mean, I'm sitting here in the US where with a lot of this stuff, you're kind of on your own. So I'm looking over some of these borders and thinking, man, that actually sounds kind of nice to be stuck in a pandemic hotel for a couple of weeks. But at the same time, I'm sure it's very different on the ground. Even if you're in China, when they're really taking care of you, I'm sure it's a pain in the ass, just like it is for everybody else, to not be able to do certain things, not to be able to see your family, not be able to go to work. There's a lot of issues that can arise, but it is good, I think, that they were and have been and hopefully are continuing to try to take care of people when they're left in the lurch like that. I think that's, if you're going to take that approach, that's the right way to do it. Oh yeah, not all countries could have managed that with the lockdowns. Totally agree. That's one of the benefits of a top-down system with the elements of it that go right. They don't always go right, and there's a lot of trade-offs, but that, in my mind, is probably part of why in Rome they had dictators come in and run things during wartime. I'm not saying it's a good idea necessarily, but I understand why they did that, because then you can make executive decisions and just make everybody do it, as opposed to, in some cases, running into the endless debate and the paralysis by analysis that unfortunately we've seen a lot of countries, my own included, succumb to in some circumstances during these types of emergencies that require very quick action. Oh, and then about the drones story. It is a matter of time before there is a mass casualty event. Technology is great to a point, but when is enough enough? It will always fall into the wrong hands. Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately that's true. I personally would argue that stepping back and saying enough is enough in the sense of not developing things any further probably isn't the best option. Personal opinion here. Because then that leaves us in a situation where potentially then an asteroid is coming and we don't have the technology to deflect it. And just because we don't know about it, because we can't detect it, or just because we can't do anything about it, that doesn't make anything, acts of nature like that, any worse. There are problems that emerge from every technology we create, and that includes language. that includes in some of the most peaceful, wonderful things that we have today are also the source of so much pain and horribleness. And I don't think we can have one without the other. I do tend to think, though, we're better off if we try to develop more intentionally, as opposed to saying, let's stop. I don't necessarily know that that's what you're implying there, but I have heard that argument that there's a type of intellectual or technological degrowth that is implicitly, in some circles, better because technology is what causes us so much stress and harm. And it's kind of a backward-looking thing where it's like, oh, things were so much easier back when I didn't have to worry about this, and wars happening halfway around the world, and I didn't have to worry about nuclear destruction. And those are very fair arguments and very legitimate feelings to have. But at the same time, I worry that if we don't develop our capabilities, we will be in the same position we were most of human history, where most children were dying before they reached age 2, and when we didn't have antibiotics. Now, we have to be more careful because the way that we're using technology and the way our other systems and philosophies and governing models are developing, we're also wearing out our antibiotics. And we might find ourselves in that position again because of the way that we use them, because of the way the medical system works, and because of the incentives that exist within our R&D and medical device and product industries. That's a problem too. And so I would posit, or I would present to you the counter theory that rather than it being necessarily technology that's causing the majority of the harm, it's our inability to wield it intelligently or intentionally based on the systems that we have in place, and that we should actually spend just as much or more time and energy evolving our systems of thinking and our systems of governance and our systems of managing scarce resources as we do currently managing our technologies and trying to have a better social network and trying to have faster, cheaper, more shotgun-carrying drones. Again, just my own opinion there, though. That's a very valid and good point. Checking. So when are you running for office? I don't think I could ever do that to myself. I appreciate politics from a distance. It's something that I find absolutely interesting, but based on what I know about it, I would not want to be personally involved in politics. All right. So if you have any more questions or comments about those two stories, feel free to drop them in the comments on Twitch or on Instagram. I'm going to go ahead and get to the third story here. Also pretty interesting. From Reuters, Spain moves to rein in crypto asset advertising. The Spanish government has announced that advertisers or marketers, including influencers, who want to promote crypto assets like cryptocurrencies or NFTs to an audience of more than 100,000 people, will have to inform the country's watchdog organization at least 10 days before the content or campaign go live. This rule seems to be at least partially the consequence of a Spanish football, that's soccer for my American listeners, football star promoting a cryptocurrency exchange on his social media accounts back in November of last year. but there are many similar, and in some cases far stricter, regulations being tossed around in legislative chambers globally as the losses to locals from crypto scams and the perhaps justified, perhaps not, fear many lawmakers feel about an asset class they don't control or necessarily understand. Pardon me, or necessarily understand, combine to make this an issue large enough to pay attention to and regulate. So, real quick definitions here. A crypto asset can be anything from crypto coins and tokens like Bitcoin and Ethereum to things like NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens, which is based on some of the same technologies. Fundamental among them, something called the blockchain, which is a usually transparent, so everybody can see it, ledger of transactions. And the transactions all have their own specific code that helps them keep track of who did what. But these are permanent, ostensibly at least, transactions. And so that's how you keep track of who owns what token. And in the cases of non-fungible tokens, where they've taken otherwise fungible, where you can exchange one for one, where one Bitcoin is equal to one Bitcoin, or $1 is equal to $1, they've taken, what they've essentially done is taken some of these dollars and had Banksy draw a piece of artwork on it and sign it. So that dollar is no longer the same as all the other dollars. It's conceivably worth more than some of the other dollars. So a non-fungible token is attaching something to these otherwise identical tokens so that they're no longer directly one-to-one exchangeable for each other. And in a lot of cases, it's art. Sometimes it's memes. People are getting really creative with this. Fundamentally, most of these is just having the same technology that we use to keep track of who's shifting tokens back and forth between each other, use as a type of currency. They're using that and then linking these tokens to something. And maybe it's an image, maybe it's a contract, maybe it's some words, maybe it's a website, whatever it happens to be. Then we say, this NFT is this piece of artwork. You now own an NFT of this Van Gogh. And it's not technically ownership. It's ownership of something that is linked to something. That is linked to one of these tokens. That is itself uniquely identifiable. And we can see who owns it because it's on this blockchain. You aged but still handsome. Thank you very much. So that context in place, Spain is regulating the promotion of crypto assets. And this is something that they're doing and something that a lot of other governments are doing. Some have already done it to varying degrees. Because within this space, in addition to some, I personally think very interesting technology, there's a whole lot of scams. The majority of the ones you've probably heard of, beyond like Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of the mainstream ones that have stuck around for a bit, if you've heard of it and you heard about it on social media and some celebrity is promoting it, probably it's a scam. And more specifically, the type of scam it almost certainly is what's called a pump and dump, which is a variation on a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme, where they create a bunch of this token that by itself isn't worth anything. It's just a bunch of, numbers essentially that you can keep track of who owns what number on a blockchain. And they make millions or billions of these things, and they give a bunch of them to a celebrity or to a soccer star in Spain, conceivably. And they say, hey, we're going to put these out into the world. We wrote up a fancy white paper that sounds very impressive. We're going to try to get a bunch of people really interested and involved in this and sell people on the idea of it. And because you are in first, and because you own 10 million of these tokens, if we can convince people to buy in and to start paying 10 cents a piece for them, or start paying more than that conceivably at some point, if the price goes up, then you can sell your tokens and make millions of dollars. And we'll do the same because we've got them. And the early people who are on board with this, if the prices do in fact go up, will also make some money. But then they need to continue to convince other people that these tokens are worth something so that they have somebody to sell their tokens to, and to sell them at a higher price than they paid for them. And that's why this is considered to be a type of Ponzi scheme or pyramid scheme, because just like all of the other pyramid schemes, the idea is to not be the last person standing when the music stops and there's no chairs left, because then you are the person who has all these tokens that have no value. And so there's a whole lot of very popular versions of this scam. And there's actually some people being taken to court right now that will probably just be fined. But I think it was some celebrities, I think one of the Kardashians, a boxer, a musician, like it's anybody with a big Instagram audience or Twitter audience, basically, and a lot of YouTubers and people with big newsletters as well. They reach out to them because they know they've got a big audience, they can give them some tokens, and it's free money for all the people at the top. And all they have to do is take money from these people who are on the other side of their social media audience. So that's why a lot of these regulations are occurring. Part of it, potentially too, and this is absolutely the case in places where they're trying to create their own crypto assets. This is true in China. I know the US has looked at creating its own digital dollar as well. And in those cases, like the digital yuan in China, is meant to be a stable coin. And the idea is that it is pegged in value to a regular yuan, the currency, or the bill, rather, of the currency in China. And so the idea is that rather than this being a fluctuating speculative asset, the way like a Bitcoin would be, where a Bitcoin goes up and down in price and you buy it almost like you're buying a stock or gold, and you're hoping you can pay low and sell high, these digital currencies run by governments would primarily just be swapped in for paper bills and coins. And the idea is that this is a currency that the government controls absolutely, and they're able to track who has it. They can reach into your bank account and take out the taxes or fines if they want to at any point. They can see who's doing crimes because they can see how the money's moving back and forth, and they can conceivably say, well, they didn't do any business for that. They didn't report that on their taxes. They're doing crimes. And then they can just reach in because they control the digital assets and take out what you owe or punish you and take away all your money. So it's very good for governments to have this kind of power. In some ways, it would be more convenient for citizens as well. But it's a very different type of cryptography-based asset. Some of them would use a blockchain, a lot of them would not, especially the ones that are run by governments because they don't want this to all be public knowledge. But they're similar in that sense. They are crypto assets, and some of these governments are afraid of these other crypto assets that they don't control taking hold and becoming popular, because then that takes up all the air that they want to have available for their asset. So you'll see stories on both of these, stories where they're regulating because they're trying to protect people from scams, and they're trying to punish people who do scams, and because in some cases they're trying to make sure that they can control the conversation around crypto, and they can control all the laws and the practice of being able to use this type of digital currency. Now let me know if you have any questions or comments on that or any of these other stories. Another comment here. I didn't mean to come across as anti-technology. Science and technology, so important, especially the last few years. People with ill intentions will always find a way to hurt others. Totally agree. Yeah, and I didn't think you sounded anti-technology. I was extrapolating, and I've heard that the argument that I posited, the regressive approach to technology many times, and from some very smart people. It is a good argument in some ways. I disagree with it because just thinking at the things, the capabilities that we lose and the ability to prevent suffering that we lose if we don't have control of these technologies and continue to evolve them, that seems like a really significant loss to me. But from other perspectives, especially arguably the perspective of non-human life, it's good, especially with technologies and business and the expanse of human beings doing things the way that we do things now, where it tends to be extractive rather than more sustainable or renewable, regenerative rather. I could understand if you're like a rabbit or a tree, where you might be thinking, yeah, just get rid of your technology, fools. I mean, you're killing everybody so that you can have these homes, you can weave us into clothing. I mean, even our fundamental technologies can be extractive. And so from that standpoint, looking at life more holistically, at least the way that we do technology and research and development and the production of that technology right now, I mean, it's not great for other life. I hope we get to a point where that's no longer the case and we become good custodians and people who are able to see more and do more, but we use that leverage and that additional potency that we have for the good of all life, which we're then able to bring into our aura of empathy. But we're not there yet. So I can understand those arguments even if those weren't the arguments you were making, long story short. Let's see. Lots of noise around crypto, names I never heard of in the Philippine social media at the moment, I think, or maybe at the market. But yeah, I mean, this is especially the case. Well, no, I don't think I can generalize like that. It's the case pretty much everywhere right now. Depending on which circles you run in, you'll hear more about it. I know a whole lot of people who have knowingly or unknowingly become part of those types of systems, including the pyramid schemey versions of it. There's a whole lot of, it's very common to hear the justification that people support the technology and can't wait to see where it's going, but then most of their enthusiasms and investments are in trying to just make as much money as possible before the music stops and, you know, somebody's without a chair. I get that. I mean, you know, we're all in different places financially, and I can understand how the idea of an easy buck might seem appealing. And I think that's a message that's more likely to go further, faster in places where there's more such people, potentially. But it's also probably, like many elements of culture, something that is a bit contagious and spreads in a rational way. If you actually looked at a map at how these things are spreading, you'd probably see them go from here to here to here, and then they'll not be so popular here because enough people got scammed or got wise about it, and then they'll move elsewhere. So it may be that in the Philippines right now, it's a hot moment to the point where it's not necessarily celebrities promoting it, but it's the people who eventually then tempt the celebrities with the promise of fast cash. I don't know. I'm personally really looking forward to watching the documentary that will inevitably happen about this period in history. And the way these things are going, it's probably going to come out in like 5 years. These things come out so quickly these days. I can't tell you how many documentaries I've watched about my childhood over the past couple of years. And it's weird, makes you feel a bit old to watch the documentaries and see people in their historian voice talking about the things that you did as a kid. But the documentaries that are made about the pandemic, about all the weird politics, about all the saber rattling that's happening worldwide right now, about all the technologies that we have, some of which are, I'll probably talk about this at some point on one of these streams this week, but some of them are so fundamentally groundbreaking that it could change everything. Nuclear fusion. We're finally at a point, and we've been at a point, I know, since the mid-20th century where it's 10 or 20 years away, but we're at a point where they've actually got models of reactors that will be very small and modular that actually seem to work. And once they're finished building it, they can probably get some of these early ones to the point where they're getting a net gain. And nuclear fusion as opposed to fission, which is what we use in all the nuclear reactors today. Fission creates nuclear waste. It's fairly expensive. It takes a whole lot of land to run all of the old model ones, at least. There's a lot of downsides. There's a lot of upsides to it, but there's a lot of downsides as well. But nuclear fusion, just by definition, the way that it works, this is the reaction, the physics that the sun uses to create energy. We know enough about how that works now that the main challenge is just keeping the reaction going and then containing it in such a way that we're able to then tap into the heat that it generates, or in some other way tap into the energy that it generates. And there's 3 or 4 different teams working in different places, in some cases companies, sometimes government associated, and sometimes university associated, that are just on the brink where they're like this close to being able to get more energy out than they put in to contain this reaction. A reaction, by the way, that if something goes wrong, it stops. So there's no chance of it blowing up or going Chernobyl. This is something that is inherently much safer, and it doesn't create waste the way that nuclear fission does. So that type of technology, which is theoretically, it's something that we could have the first versions of these that we might get net gain energy out of in the next 3 or 4 years, that could change everything, because that could conceivably create a situation where energy is not as scarce, at least eventually, if we can build enough of these things. Energy is not scarce the way that it is today. And scarcity is something that, scarcity of all things, is what shapes the world and the way that it looks today. Everything from economics to conflict, the way that we live our lives, the fact that we have to work jobs and earn money. These are things that are the consequence of scarcity. And so if we're able to take these types of technologies, that one and numerous others that we're looking at and working on and have moved forward substantially on over the past decade or two, especially, that could change a whole lot of things really quickly. And that's really exciting to me. It's something that it's been a long time coming with most of these technologies. Some of them are quite new, like some of the approaches that we have that might be able to allow us to get rid of all viruses or get rid of all diseases or weed out predispositions before we're born so that we don't have debilitating diseases that we don't want genetically, things that we could choose to have or not to have if we want to. These are things that are comparably relatively recent. Some of these we've been working on for hundreds of years, but they're all about to arrive because of a confluence of other factors. And that's something that, I mean, it really could change a lot of the fundamentals of the world that we live in today. I think it's very exciting. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent with that, but that's something that it fires up my enthusiasm for what we're capable of as humans. And it makes me hopeful that some of these things that we have to worry about today and that do orchestrate our lives to greater or lesser degrees might not be as authoritative in our lives as they are currently, out of necessity. While I was saying that, I actually just remembered, too, that I have a couple of questions that people submitted. Let's see here. Some folks submitted some questions ahead of time before this stream today. And again, continue, if you have any questions or comments on those stories or anything that I'm saying, please feel free to comment in Twitch or Instagram. But one of the questions that I got beforehand here was, how do you decide which news stories to include in any given issue of One Sentence News, which is the publication that I send out every weekday morning, and it has the summary and context, one sentence apiece, of 3 different stories. That's the resource that I've been using tonight for these topics. And the stuff that I've been reading out is my summary and my quick bit of context for these different stories that I've amalgamated from other sources. The short answer is that I just try to keep in mind the big picture with this, and I try over time to give a good jumble of stuff happening. I try not to do too much on the same thing. I try to do big topics when I can, but if I feel stuff is being over-reported, I'll try to hit on smaller things that I think are being ignored. I try to do more things from around the world than a lot of American publications do, just because I feel like that gives a better sense of what's happening elsewhere. And I think it serves us well to get out of our bubbles wherever we happen to be living on the planet. And I do try, when I find I'm reporting on too many things that are a bit sad, or a bit, that are likely to cause stress or anxiety or sadness, I'll try to bring in some inspirational things as well. And not like the sugary sweet, here's a person who had this fun thing and nice thing happened to them sorts of things. There's a time and a place for that. It's not really the type of story that I track or that I try to put out. I try to find things like I was just talking about, actually, the idea that we might have fusion reactors soon and what that might mean for the planet. Those are very inspiring, happiness-inducing things for me. So I try to make a mix, and I try to think of it as a continuum, as a process, rather than just one email. So ideally, if you subscribe, hopefully you're exposed Hopefully you're exposed to a decent mix of news types, of news locations, of news focuses, and ebbs and flows in what the news maybe makes you feel as a consequence as well. That's my intention anyway. I'm definitely not perfect at it, and this is something I've been running less than a year, so I'm sure I have plenty left to learn in that regard. Positive vibes from London. Thank you for the positive vibes. And I had one other question that was sent ahead of time as well, from somebody who was at yesterday's Let's Talk About the News live stream. I suggested to people who didn't have a good, consistent news source that good, bare, basic, just like vanilla ice cream news sources that are almost always, no news source is always reliable, but almost always reliable in terms of not getting biased and in terms of getting their facts right. If you have to do just two, a good place to start is just Reuters and the Associated Press. I then added to that, if you wanted to do something a bit more mainstream, and you wanted to get a decent balance as well, you could expand that with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Just ignore their editorials for both of them. The editorials in the New York Times tend to lean a bit left. The editorials in the Wall Street Journal tend to err a bit to the right. Editorials in most newspapers and news programs tend to be the most biased, fact-distorting elements of these entities, though, so I would recommend ignoring all of that as much as possible. That's the type of stuff that tends to conceal the actual facts. People can say whatever they want. They're not fact-checked barely ever, and you typically want to stick with something as dry as possible if you want to be informed and not get riled up and not be put into tribal groups and have people try to shake you and make you feel certain things and make you feel emotional and try to get you to do stuff or buy things, most commonly. But I would add to that, this person had asked basically, in addition to those, what other publications, other than the big mainstream ones and other than just the raw fact ones, other than things that are just presenting raw facts without the toxifying editorials, would you recommend? And typically I find Axios and Quartz are both pretty good in terms of being good summations, typically. They tend to cover slightly different topics, but Axios is like a bullet point style of article, where typically they will take other sources and they'll give you a great, very short 500-word or less summary of just the details and then some flavor text, some quotes from the sources, maybe some, here's what different people are reporting on this sort of thing. So Axios is pretty good for that. They also have very good charts and very good graphs, and they share their data. And then Quartz, they meander a bit from topic to topic. They get focuses, and they establish new focuses each year. So they tend to do some more focused original reporting on that. But they also tend to do some good summaries, and they have very good visuals as well. Beyond that, though, for the sort of news that isn't just here's a story, here's the facts, but more exploratory, in-depth reporting about a particular topic, I really enjoy Hakai magazine, Hakai magazine. It's all about ocean and underwater life and underwater science, and they've taken this very, I mean, to most people it would seem like a very niche topic, and they make it just endlessly fascinating. And they do a wide range of stories and a bunch of different people writing the stories. They're very factually oriented, but there's a lot of narrative mixed in with the information. So it'll point at something that you didn't know existed or didn't know you should care about, related to aquatics, underwater stuff, marine life, the fishing industry, things like that, whales, and it'll present it to you in a way that is very authoritative and interesting and well written. Rest of World is also quite good. They've been around a couple of years, and they do, to me, very good reporting that has a bit of narrative, not as much as Hakai, I think, but they do very good reporting from places that are not reported on as much. And so there's a lot of places in Africa, a lot of countries there that just don't get any attention from the international press. Parts of the Middle East, parts of Central Asia, that just don't get any press. And so they have people on the ground in these places that they pay to report on stories in these places. And the writing is almost always stellar, and it'll almost always be topics that you have not heard about anywhere else, which is fantastic. Aeon and Nautilus are two other websites, like online magazines. I don't know if they have print editions, but they're two online magazines, Aeon and Nautilus, that are just beautifully written science work, science reporting. They have some opinion pieces mixed in there too, but it's typically opinions or editorials written by experts on a particular facet of science or medicine or psychology or something like that. And they tend to be interesting as well, even if they're not the rote recitation of something that happened with a particular experiment, which I also tend to enjoy. And then also, too, if you're looking to get your sources in line and don't have a good innate sense yet of which sources are biased toward which things in which direction, there's two resources I would recommend. One is called The Factual, and it uses a combination of human assessment and an algorithm that they've generated to figure out the reliability of different sources in terms of how many facts they're presenting and how many facts they're bringing in from other legitimate sources, but then also which way they tend to pivot politically. So this isn't as useful for biases toward non-political things and non-left-right biased political things, but it does give you a good sense that you can just look at some of these sources and they'll tell you, well, this story on this topic was 82% authoritative because it has so many really good sources and so many citations of these different facts that they've pulled in, and so it's reliable for that topic, and they tend to be right-leaning or center-right or left or far left or whatever it happens to be. So it's a good way to, over time, you can go through their curated stories and get a sense of what these different publications have to offer in terms of their bias, but then also in terms of their reliability. And Ground News does a similar thing. Their UI and navigation isn't my favorite. Sometimes it's a bit cumbersome to figure out what's happening, but their approach is to take what's happening in the news that day and to take the story as an element and then show you how all the different publications are reporting on that one story, which can be useful if you're looking to get a more three-dimensionalized view of a particular topic and trying to better understand what actually happened, rather than getting a version of events that might be more appealing to one political party or ideological group or another. So those two, The Factual and Ground News, also tend to be quite helpful in terms of assessing that and periodically checking in, because every once in a while, these different sources can kind of change their quality or their leaning because they're bought or because a new editor-in-chief comes in, and so it's good to keep track of that if you can. Are there any other questions before I log off for the night about anything that I just talked about, or any of those stories that we summarized earlier? Checking nothing on Twitch. Not seeing anything on Instagram. If you do have something and it comes to you later, please feel free to send me a message on, I think you can do that on Twitch or on Instagram. You can also send me an email at colin@exilelifestyle.com. And if you'd like to get these sorts of curated stories in your inbox each morning, you can sign up. It's a free subscription, onesentencenews.com. And then if you'd like to do a more in-depth to some of these stories each week, I put out a podcast each week on Tuesdays called Let's Know Things, and you can get that anywhere you currently get your podcasts. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This blast. Fun having an outlet to talk about these things, but also to hear some of your questions and what you think about these topics. That's very helpful to round out my own view, so I appreciate that. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. Like I said, I'm planning at least to do these all week at this same time. So if you can make it, I'd love to see you again tomorrow night. For the time being, though, wherever you happen to be in the world, good night, good morning, good afternoon. Have a lovely day.